if I told you that Jesus Christ in the New Testament condoned marrying 3-year-olds?
I'd say you've not read the New Testament, so let's see what you got.
Is it 2-for-1 deal today?
23 pulled up. It says, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you.
Yeah, notice verse 2 qualifies what Jesus is saying. It says when they sit in Moses' seat, do as they say. So when they read from the Torah, do as they tell you.
So a few things to address here right off the bat. The first being that the passage actually does not say when they sit in Moses' seat, nor would what they read from Moses while sitting in such a seat be called what they say, because it's not what they said, it's what Moses said. The second thing to address here is that the seat of Moses does not refer to an actual seat. There's actually no evidence that there ever was such a seat in the synagogue system, and from what we can derive from Scripture, one would not sit to read the Scriptures. One would actually stand to read the Scriptures, and when they sat, they would give exposition on it. Luke 4:16 exhibits Jesus standing to read the Scriptures, and then in verses 20 and 21 tells us that he sat down and then he gave his personal exposition on it. In addition to elucidating on the Scriptures, sitting down is also heavily associated with rendering judgment, aka giving interpretation of the law of Moses throughout the text of Scripture, in such places as Exodus 18:13, Proverbs 31:23, 2 Samuel 19:8, and Job 29:7 through 10. All of these mention sitting in a place of honor, being seated while rendering judgment. Exodus 18:13 in particular is where we would get this idea of the seat of Moses. It represents a position of authority, not a physical location.
And the scholar Michael Cosby notes that Jesus avoids using the word for teach in this passage. It only says do as they say, because they didn't know how to properly interpret the Scriptures.
Michael Cosby might have had a great point if this were not already commonplace Pharisaic mode of speech. As it stands, it's more or less just a semantical argument that's void of any cultural context. While both the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds are absolutely replete with examples of Rabbi so-and-so said in the name of Rabbi so-and-so who used to say, the easiest example to use would be Pirkei Avot because of the frequency of such phrasing within such a small text. Note the use of the word omer here, which means to say, and not yada, zahar, yara, lamad, or any other word that might translate loosely into English as teach, depending on the context.
Area in which Jesus previously has demonstrated the Pharisees' incompetence.
So it isn't exactly fair or appropriate to say that he was demonstrating the incompetence of Pharisees and broadly applying that to all Pharisees, especially given that there were multiple schools of Pharisees at the time, and the disagreements that he takes with certain Pharisees can mainly be attributed to one school of Phariseeism, being Beit Shammai, and his disagreements with them, he usually upholds the teachings of Beit Hillel. So he is demonstrating the incompetence of one school of Phariseeism by upholding the teachings of another school of Phariseeism. There is also even the possibility that he's not actually even referring to legitimate Pharisees at all. Given that the accusation is hypocrisy, appearing and teaching one way while behaving another, there is even Talmudic evidence of such a group existing, those who appeared like Pharisees, but lived according to another standard.
Okay, so Jesus Christ was telling the people to follow the Pharisees and everything they taught.
No, he wasn't. Prior to this in Matthew, Jesus already condemned the teachings and the traditions of the Pharisees.
It's a very interesting list of verses, though I think under scrutiny they might not exactly say what you think they say. There are three primary questions we have to ask ourselves when focusing on Matthew 15 in particular. What are the traditions of men? What is the commandment of God? And which of these is found in the Mishnah? While you've posted Matthew 15, 7 through 9, the dispute actually begins in verse 3 and runs through verse 6. And the dispute at hand is whether or not it is appropriate to use money that has been vowed to the temple, aka vowed to God, to help one's parents who are financially destitute. So it's not actually even a matter of traditions of men versus commandments of God. Both of these are commandments of God. A strict and rigid rendering of Torah law concerning vows, especially vows made to God, would be that you are bound to those vows indefinitely. How does this work when that vow conflicts with our ability to honor our father and mother? That is the dispute at hand. The position that Jesus is arguing against is one that says that you are in fact indefinitely bound to that vow, and therefore may not use the funds which were vowed to the temple to help financially destitute parents. This is not a position really that you find supported in the Mishnah. In fact, we find quite the opposite. We find exactly what Jesus himself was arguing. Regarding Matthew 15:14, as previously demonstrated, this cannot be applied broadly to all Pharisees, and at best can only apply to maybe one school of Pharisees that existed at the time. What I mainly want to focus on here, though, is your reference to Matthew 16, which involves both Sadducees and Pharisees, which were on complete opposite ends of the philosophical spectrum. That being the case, if what you're implying that Jesus is teaching is against the Pharisaic additions to the law that we find in the Mishnah, then you'd be arguing a Sadducean position, yet he includes Sadducees here in this rebuke. So that can't be what he's referring to. What's more is if we go back and look at 16 verses 1 through 4, we find that the discussion had nothing to do with doctrine and everything to do with the fact that both, in this instance, had asked him for a sign from heaven. It was this insistence on a supernatural sign which they had in common which Jesus was referring to. To extrapolate anything further from this passage is demanding more from the passage than it can reasonably uphold in the wake of contradictory evidence.
To quote Davies and Allison in their commentary, since believers did not themselves have copies of the Torah, they must learn Moses from the synagogue, but they should keep Moses without heeding the interpretations offered by the scribes and Pharisees, interpretations which are manifested by the reader's deeds.
The passage at hand does not agree with that synopsis, given that Jesus clearly says that these Pharisees do not practice what they teach. Ergo, their behavior was not even in alignment with their own teaching. It actually appears that Jesus seems to agree with Pharisaic teaching so much that he even believes that Pharisees, in addition to his own followers, should live by it.
Ulrich Luz said, "It is in my judgment impossible to assume that Matthew actually called his church to obey all the teachings of the scribes and Pharisees."
Well, that's obviously not true. None of Jesus' teachings can be found to be categorically unpharisaic. Conversely, nearly all of his teachings can be found within the confines of Pharisaic philosophy in the compendium of collected rabbinic literature. It actually makes this kind of assumption more naturally made than rejected. Alternate Media discusses the topic of Jesus' association with the Pharisees in more depth in our article series, Jesus the Pharisee, the most recent of which specifically deals with Matthew 23 in its entirety. But I do agree with you 100% that the New Testament does not condone child marriage in any way, so let's turn our attentions to our Muslim friend here. Does the Talmud actually claim what he is saying?
Do you not know what the Jewish Talmud says about marriage? A girl who is 3 years and 1 day old, whose father arranged her betrothal, is betrothed through intercourse?
It's important first to note that the Talmud and the Mishnah are both legal documents. They lack emotional tone as they are dealing with matters that are sometimes uncomfortable and have to be spoken about in very direct terms. Oftentimes, they actually deal with matters where there is more than one law of Moses at play, and they appear to make some kind of a conflict with one another, as we saw earlier. The particular part of the Mishnah that he is citing from deals with how a bride is legally acquired, in fact, not as a matter of permission, but as a matter of fact. In other words, it's not saying you can acquire a bride this way. It's saying, if you do this, you have acquired a bride. It's not a legal rendering on whether or not it is permissible to do this. It is a legal rendering on your status as a now married man who is financially responsible for a bride and financially responsible to pay her father. It may be beating a dead horse here, but the passage is not saying that it's allowed. It's not giving permission to do this. It is giving a prescription for if this terrible thing happens. The permissibility of this act is another issue altogether discussed elsewhere in Mishnah. This is all confirmed by the explanation on the Mishnah, which our friend here would have been wise to look into, which explains that this act is obviously grape. So it's obviously not permissible to do, but it still has legally binding repercussions if you do it. Given that that is an obvious understanding of what this act truly is, that is dealt with elsewhere in the Mishnah and has its own repercussions. You can pause to read. The reality is that neither the New Testament nor the Mishnah condones the marrying via intercourse of someone so young. But the New Testament does support the idea that Jesus was teaching his followers to obey Pharisaic teaching.